Hello, this is Chance. I'm going to tell you about some of my favorite fishing lures today. These were made by Daniel B. Cellar, who spent most of his life around Pittsburg, Pennsylvania. He was born in 1887 and passed away in 1981. Around 1950, he moved to St. Petersburg, Florida, where he spent the remainder of his life. He moved with the intention of doing a lot of fishing, but unfortunately, his wife became ill and he had to spend much of his time assisting her. At some point in his life, he made fishing lures. I first heard of these when they were offered in the 2015 Morphe auction. They were part of the Bob Wentz collection. There were three lots, and I just thought they looked really neat. I was fortunate to win one at the actual auction, and then since then have acquired more examples. And this has been one of my best research projects in terms of vintage homemade full cart fishing lures. I published an article about Mr. Cellar. They split it in two parts in the National Fishing Lure Collectors Club Gazette. The first part was in the winter 2024 issue, and the second part was in the spring 2025 issue. I was fortunate to make contact with Mr. Cellar's grandchildren, who had more fishing lures, that had photos and information about the man and his life, and that was really, really useful information. Even without that information, I thought these were great fishing lures, but anytime you can connect names and places and dates to things, it really enhances the experience with them. Let's take a look at some of these and make note of some of the characteristics that are distinctive to Mr. Cellar's fishing lure artwork. These look like there's a great variety, and there are. His painted surfaces are wonderful. He really was painting and thoughtful with his surfaces. Most of them are not just paint on wood. He really was going in there and applying dots, different colors, very thoughtful in his approach to the finish. Unfortunately, they were stored poorly. It's the varnish that he used over the paint probably reacted with different materials where they were stored. Humidity, hot, cold, things like that have affected a lot of the surfaces, but even with some of those issues, they're still really beautiful pieces. He made a couple different kinds of minnows. A couple of my favorites are these. They kind of have a kind of scalloped face. I mean, look at the way he made those kind of triangle shapes on there. These are really beautiful, but you can tell that the paint is really kind of worn on this side, probably from being stored on some kind of a foam or something for a long time. And then that bait kind of has a twin in this one. I just think these are really cool. These, before I specifically placed them to Pennsylvania, there was some speculation that if that attribution wasn't correct, maybe they could have been made in the Alliance, Ohio area, because some of his eye treatment is similar to like, Ray Klippinger, who's, one of the better known Alliance, Ohio area makers. But fortunately, it's a positive attribution that I was able to place by contact with family members. I love this little minnow. These have a hand cut diving lip. The hardware is rather simple, screw eyes of various types, just simple treble hooks for the most part, but this one has a little carved fishtail, little bead eyes, just really lovely little bait there. His other minnows tend to have this full length plate along the belly that's hand cut, kind of have a fish tail, have a little bit of a humped back, bead eyes. Some of them have these Luxon line ties, which were commercially produced. If you know Bomber fishing lures, they pretty much all came with those. The hardware on these is wire that runs under that metal plate from the line tie to the rear. Even the belly hook hanger is actually some of that wire that just runs through. This one's painted differently It has this black and the kind of gold yellow, and then he's gone over it with gold circles, really making a really beautiful painterly kind of expressive surface. Um, an interesting one, this is painted kind of like the early Pardee minnows, from Ohio. I think that was another reason some thought maybe they were from Ohio. So maybe he knew about those baits, or maybe it was just convenient just to do a simple kind of dunk in the paint can, but I think it's cool. I'm not sure what he used as washers behind the eye. Maybe they're old clothes buttons that, he stuck a pin through. I don't know, but you can see the full-length metal belly plate, same kind of wire. Some other variations that are similar, kind of splotchy paint on that, and this one has neat eyes. The belly plate doesn't go all the way to the back on this one. He also made frogs. They have the hand-cut diving lip. They pretty much all have the split legs. A couple of them have wire running between the legs, and they have this, kind of hide material that's secured on a piece of wire. To give the bit in the water that would really move around a lot. You can imagine that kind of wiggling. The frogs are pretty much all green with little spots on them, or brown like this one. One of the most interesting things about these are these tags that some have. Like this one has an F. There's really no information that's been found to document exactly what that means. It's assumed that Mr. Cellar did put these on them himself, but even that is not specifically clear. Maybe the F means frog, in the sense that this one is attached to a frog. That would make sense, but there's no other markings on that tag. This minnow also has a tag, but man, look at that. It has like a FSD, and maybe that's a ALL. Is it all? Then it even has a W or an M or a 3 on the back of it. Just really hard to know. But it's interesting, if he was cataloging his work, it'd be really cool to figure out what those symbols mean. These polywogs are some of my favorites that he made. These have, basically like a painted face. You can see the mouth and the eyes, have a lot of personality. This kind of has that orange paint with kind of splotchy decoration on it. The hook is secured in the body, probably, attached to a nail or a wire or something in there. This one has a tag out here, some S's, and I don't know if that says Sam on it. Then it has I'm thinking that's a 2 on that one. There's some variations of these. Look at this guy. Unfortunately his paint's a little bad on the top there, but man, look at that. He's just like full of fun. They have a belly weight here. So they're thoughtful pieces. Some of the other variations of those polywogs are what I call the sunfish polywog. Look at this one. Again, has some paint issues, probably from storage, has the same kind of hook apparatus, a lead weight in here, the hand-cut diving lip, really wonderful personality, some really cool paint, just exudes folk art character. Mr. Cellar was not just making fishing lures. That is what they are, but I sense a self-expression in these. They really go into art. I think there's a real problem in the fishing lure collecting community that every single homemade fishing lure gets the label folk art. And I even have a lot in my collection that, to me, they don't really reach artfulness to me. They're neat. I love them. They're homemade. They've a lot of characteristics about them fit what I'm looking for. But at the end of the day, what really matters the most to me is self-expression and uniqueness, qualities that put one individual's work over that of another and not just being a homemade fishing lure. And Mr. Cellar definitely made some cool stuff. There's a couple of baits that I got from Mr. Cellar's granddaughter that are not completely homemade. They're either maybe kit baits that maybe for Christmas or something he got a kit. This one, is like a South Bend Bassarino, but it has these decal eyes that were very common in, fishing lure maker kits back in the 1950s. Especially since the hardware's kind of random. I don't think there was ever a Bassarino style lure that was made with, cupped side hooks. So maybe he rigged this one 100% from scratch, but he didn't make the body. But clearly the paint is his, the diving lip is his, has the same kind of undercut gills that a lot of the minnows have. Same kind of paint issues that a lot of the other baits have. Really neat. Another one that is either from the lure maker kit or a modified bait is this what looks like a creek chub wounded minnow. Has a propeller out front and the rear. They're clearly not just homemade ones. Has the same kind of eye and scalloped face that a lot of Mr. Cellar's minnows have. A creek chub wounded minnow would only have a hook here on one side of this flat edge and then here at the back. So this one's been modified in various ways that, again, kind of makes me think maybe it was from a lure maker kit, but you can see the paint. It's very, very similar to what's on some of these other ones. It definitely makes sense that Mr. Cellar was involved in these. The rest are very homemade and don't really specifically reference any other vintage baits. There's two kind of like this, these kind of chunky minnows. They're kind of wide, kind of flat on top of the head, with the hand cut diving lip. Kind of unusual, but look at the paint on that. And there's a twin to it. It's very, very similar. They have belly weights, hooks on the sides, hook out back. I've spent a lot of time speculating what maybe he made first, what were the later ones, things like that. And it's really hard to know because it is possible that he worked on them at various times. And one that's kind of a crowd pleaser that whenever, these are viewed in person, this little kind of worm bait, kind of caterpillar is always a favorite. It had rubber appendages at one point. Unfortunately, those are been broken off, but a really neat bug there. Some of my favorites out of this collection are the crawdads. Fortunately, this one still has his legs intact, but they're pretty fragile at this point, so I sort of expect them to start popping off at any point. But I guess we'll try to just keep them together as long as we can. They have eyes back here on the rear end. They have that flat metal plate that runs all along the body. Most of these kind of have this cut at the front, kind of makes you think of the old creek chub crab. So it's likely he was aware of fishing lures that were commercially available, but for whatever reason, he was interested in just crafting his own. This is an unusual crawdad here, in that it's not painted really like a naturalistic crawdad like the other ones. You can tell it had, little legs at one point, but look at the paint's really fun. Got the eyes and even a mouth back there. Lovely little piece. The smallest crawdad is this one. I actually have a couple minnows that are this small as well. It's harder to get the character in the small stuff that you can the bigger, but I still think this definitely reads as a Cellar bait. One of the more unusual forms is this weird diving bug thing. Kind of cool, swirly kind of paint. This one's kind of an odd one. Almost like a little Rush tango turned backwards. maybe. But I think it's completely homemade. I don't think he modified anything else. And then there's these little pumpkin seeds. You know, little flat side, little wiggling, little bait fish. You know, obviously made by Mr. Cellar, of the same exact kind of rigging and diving lips. Like this one with the little triangles, you know, taped off on the sides, you know, to get the different, you know, it's kind of hard edge on it. And there's a cool one here. Yeah. Yeah, you know, you see those paint issues when you look at them. A couple that are unusual are these that have homemade propellers on them. This is this quad propeller, big chunky kind of surface minnow. Has this quad prop at the front and just a single at the back, but those are obviously homemade. I have a couple of smaller little popper kind of baits that have, you know, a single propeller going with them. And then two that are unusual. It's this sort of simple stick bait. You know, this one's not real exciting, but it does have the quad prop, but it has the name Harry written on the underside there, which is unusual. And none of Mr. Cellar's grandchildren seem to be aware of the significance of what Leora, this bait, has written on it, or Harry has written on the other one has. There's a couple of these minnows that are jointed. They have a flat piece of sheet metal in there that's held in with pins, you know, and they give a little jointed action. I think these are really cool baits. I've really enjoyed having them and continue looking for them. Last year, I got in contact with Mr. Cellar's grandson, and he had his grandfather's 1952 to 53 Florida fishing license, and I think that's a really cool thing to have. You learn a lot about these individuals, just, you know, their age at the time, and, you know, their height and weight and all that. You know, it doesn't seem like he was a big guy. It says he weighs 125 pounds in 1952 to 53 and 5'9". So, yeah, kind of cool artifact. I have pictures that the family had, and it's a lot of fun to connect those dots. And I think his grandchildren were excited to know that their grandfather was recognized for this creative achievement. I'll continue to be a steward for these, and hopefully continue to connect these homemade fishing lures into the broader world of folk art and outsider art and the world of sporting collectibles, and hopefully in time help get some more recognition for these wonderful objects. I'll see you in the next video.